All right, good morning, and thanks so much for inviting NHMRC to come and speak with you this morning. As mentioned, Steve Wessling really was keen to be here to talk with you this morning, and we thought we had things lined up, but the Australian Senate had different plans, so at the moment I think he's waiting to be grilled by the Senate estimates process, and I'm sorry that takes trumps over everything else he has to do. So, but I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk to, I guess, a broad discussion about NHMRC's priorities, what we're trying to achieve at the moment, and I guess some really great opportunities and challenges that we would like to discuss with you. So it'll be a broad-ranging, I guess, tour through all the things that NHMRC does. I'd like also to join in my acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the Yaga and Turrbal people whose lands we meet on, and also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people of the lands where I live and work in Canberra, and pay my respect to elders past, present, emerging, and also to acknowledge any First Nations people that might be joining here and also online through the meeting. And we'll talk a bit about NHMRC's the work we're doing to look to close the gap around how we can drive funding for research, health and medical research that's specifically looking to focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, and also to boost capacity and have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people leading more research that we fund. And we've got some targets that we're quite proud of. I'll talk about that in my slides. But before I get into much more about what NHMRC is doing at the moment, I'm just going to look back, looking back 90 years actually, which is sort of remarkable to us that this has come around. But next year, NHMRC will have its 90th anniversary, and I might feel slightly self-indulgent to take a moment to talk about us and how great this organisation is. I guess I think of it as Steve Wessling as our CEO, and the CEOs that came before him, and my colleagues that make up the office of the NHMRC. We are really brief custodians of this national institution, and we're only there for a short period of time in the context of this organisation. And I think at the moment, the way that the political landscape is changing, it has changed in Australia over recent years, but it's certainly, if we look internationally, I think these sorts of national institutions like the NHMRC have an incredibly important place in our political and social landscape. And the funding and the work we do around equity and in trying to improve the health of all Australians, which is really our mission, I think is, I feel privileged to be able to be part of that long tradition. So we're going to be looking at doing some sort of communication and maybe some events and things next year. Just, I think if nothing else, again, to promote that point that the NHMRC needs to continue in the mission that it's been doing over that 90-year period. And it certainly has changed a lot since the first meeting in 1937. The gender equity is much better than in this picture. The age of the participants is probably a bit more diverse and culturally diverse. And I think that's all, of course, for the better. So I'll really be talking around different aspects of this document. And you may or may not have seen this, but for those that don't have a great passion for corporate governance and they're reading the corporate plans of government agencies, this is really our plan on a page. This summarises at the moment NHMRC's strategic priorities. And we review this every 3 years, and we run in a triennium process, and we have advisory committees that look to address particular issues that we want to prosecute that are articulated in this strategy. And really, this is the synthesis of all of that. So effectively, what I'll do is I'm going to talk through the particular actions and things we're doing to implement this strategy. But at the highest level, NHMRC always refers to having three key pillars. That is investment, translation, and integrity. So what do we mean by those things? NHMRC has about $1 billion now annually to disperse for health and medical research and training. It's sort of been growing gradually. It grows just really with inflation. We've had some step changes over the period of our investment, but really it is more or less growing really just with inflation. And I think you'll know very well that the costs of research are growing far greater than that. So we are seeing a separation between what sounds like an impressive number, $1 billion annually, but ultimately the size of grants is larger. As new technology comes online, the research is more expensive. After COVID, we saw across the whole economy large increases in costs of labour and materials and the like. And so this is an issue that ultimately the sector and the government will have to consider. We do, of course, also on the investment side, now have the Medical Research Future Fund, which is administered by the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing, as in they're responsible for it. But they work in partnership with us to administer many of those grant opportunities. So that brings in another $650 million annually. And I'll talk more about the national strategy later. But really, one of the opportunities there is how do we best take that $1.65 billion annually between those two funds and make the most use of them. Translation is, of course, where the rubber hits the road with that money. And I'll talk a bit around our translation strategy and the things that we're trying to achieve by way of meaningful outcomes and improvements to health for the community. So we're talking about greater commercial outputs of the research we fund, and we know quite well that the Australian research community does very well internationally when it comes to academic metrics of the research we produce here, but we do lag when it comes to turning those into commercial entities. And commercial entities doesn't just mean about making money. Really, if you want to get a drug into a clinic, if you want to get a device approved, you need this commercialisation part is absolutely critical, and it's a priority that I'll talk about. But of course, translation also means the advice, guideline development, changing public health policy, etc. And then finally, integrity. NHMRC has got a key responsibility under our legislation to ensure that the framework in which medical research is conducted in Australia maintains appropriate standards of ethics and integrity. And these three pillars really summarise, I guess, all the work that we do at NHMRC. I'll talk shortly about what we're doing around our committee structures and how we get advice on these things, and how we're doing that in a collaborative way now with the MRFF in a joined-up way that's never happened before. But that starts with our NHMRC Council at the very top of our advisory structures, and then we have our research committee and a range of other committees that give us advice on these things. In the green section on this slide is our strategic priorities, and these are the ones that we spend a lot of time getting advice from these committees, considering internally about what we should be focusing on this 3-year period. So at the top of that tree, I'll talk about in a moment, is to support the Department of Health and our involvement in developing this new national strategy of health and medical research. And we have never had a strategy that's overarching like this. There's been a number of very important reviews that have been helpful, and we've seen things implemented out of some of these reviews to government, but we haven't had an overarching strategy, and I think this is a great opportunity, really an inflection point at the moment, to set what we want the future to be over the next 10 years. Harmonising the MRFF and the MREA, I'll also talk about in more detail in a moment. This is, you may be aware that consultations were held around this, around how these two funds, the MREA, which is NHMRC's fund, the Medical Research Endowment Account, and the MRFF account, how they should be working more closely together, and I'll discuss that. Maintaining excellence in peer review is something that we spend many hours discussing internally and many hours discussing with our research committee around how do we ensure that the peer review system, our grant assessments, continue to be world-leading and innovative, making use of new technologies, and ensure that we're driving the best decisions around how to invest that funding. And it's, for people that are technically interested in this stuff, you can really go down some rabbit holes, and it's a very interesting area, but it's a really critically important point about how we distribute those funds, which are, you'll know from our funding rates, are very tight, so it's critical that we get good decisions around how we disperse that funding. Championing consumer involvement is a major thread of our focus this triennium, and I'll talk in more detail around what we're doing there and updating our statement, our expectations really, to all of you, to the institutions, to other funders and to the community around how consumers and community should be involved in all types of medical research, both in designing it, in participating in it, and evaluating who's funded and benefiting from it. Embedding equity in health research is a key focus, and we have a number of, I guess, streams around equity that we're wanting to pursue. We're referring to this as our equity lens, and I'll talk in more detail about that. Bolster confidence in research integrity. This is a continual topic that we hear around, is the system adequate at the moment around ensuring integrity in research? We have a key role that we play in that. I'd already mentioned a bit about translation and commercialisation, but we have a couple of committees we've set up specifically to look at this, and Steve Westling in particular is very keen to see us have greater outcomes in these two spaces. And then promote prevention and public health, and prevention is one thing we heard a lot of feedback around. We're needing to see more in the research that we fund. So then when we come to our health priorities, and NHMRC deliberately does not set disease-focused health priorities. So we don't have cancer as a specific priority or cardiovascular disease a particular priority. You'll be aware that the Medical Research Future Fund does have mission-based programs that are looking to address certain areas of focus. NHMRC, I guess, as the foundational funder of that $1 billion, we take a view that all areas of health and medical research warrant funding. We'll receive applications in any area, from basic discovery through clinical medicine, public health and health services research. And so really what you'll find is that the funding that we distribute really is a reflection of the Australian research community and the applications that come to us. So we fund in what we refer to as a investigator-initiated way. However, when we set our health priorities, really I guess what we're wanting is to focus on some structural issues or some emerging things that do require some focus. So first amongst those, and it is always a health priority for us, is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, and I'll talk more about that as I mentioned. For this triennium, the other three health priorities we've identified are artificial intelligence in health, which we've already heard a little about this morning, and as I hear you discussed yesterday. This is going to be really transformative in both how we operate as a funder, but also how research is performed and how healthcare is delivered. Thirdly, we've got emerging health threats and emergencies. This is really a continuation, I guess, from the COVID pandemic, and being aware that, you know, it's not a matter of if, but when the next health threats come, and so we want to make sure that we are well placed for that from a research perspective. And then finally, living with multiple long-term conditions. So this is around multiple chronic conditions. And we really shifted our language here from looking to, I guess, cure or deal with those conditions, which we do want to do, but also acknowledge that people live with these conditions. And so how do we ensure, while people have long-term experience of multiple chronic conditions, we are looking to improve health quality. Then we've got in blue here who we work with and our partners. And so the community and the consumers is a key area. We're talking with industry. We meet with the states and territories, and all of the chief health officers and the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer are on our council, and we meet also separately with them, and we engage them on priorities. Other agencies across the Commonwealth, but also internationally, we do quite a lot of outreach I'll talk about. Okay, so I'll now jump into more of the detail. So firstly, the draft national strategy as flagged. This is a key a key moment, I guess, for the sector with the development of this strategy. It's been discussed for quite a while, and I'll mention in a couple of slides' time the consultations we ran around bringing together or harmonising to a better degree the MRFF and the NHMRC. And one of the things we heard through that national consultation is people were, basically the key message was we want to see these come together under single agency. We want to see the funds live as separate entities that do different things, but before you do all of this, we need a national strategy to sit above all this, to actually say, where are we trying to go? What is the point of these funds and what are we trying to achieve? And so the harmonisation work and a decision around what to do with that consultation has sort of been paused to some degree while government has decided we need a national strategy to come first. And so Rosemary Huxtable was appointed by the Minister as the chair of the process to develop this strategy. Rosemary was a senior executive in the Department of Health with Deputy Secretary roles, long-term experience in health, but also was the Secretary of the Department of Finance, so she knows how government works, she knows how to get these sort of processes done. It's been a wonderful appointment as the chair of this process. A lot of work has happened up until now to produce the draft strategy, which hopefully you've all had a chance to see. Consultations on it have just closed, but it was open through from August to around now. It's as I mentioned, it's really to set a 10-year vision around what we want for health and medical research in this country. And it's not meant to be a strategy of the NHMRC. It's not meant to be a review of the NHMRC or of the MRFF. It's really to be broader and consider industry broadly and its involvement, consider philanthropy, states and territory funders and research that's conducted there in hospitals, really all encompassing. The draft strategy itself, which again I hopefully you have seen, is broken into this sort of a structure. And so the vision is Australia, the healthiest nation, driven by research, delivering for all. And again, that equity lens was really important to include. It's quite a substantial document with quite a bit of material in there. I guess one key message is it is a draft strategy, and we've heard feedback on a number of aspects about it. For example, one thing we've heard is some parts of the sector would like to see basic or discovery research be a little more prominent. So those sorts of things are really, listening is open and this is a genuine consultation. So expect the next version or the final version that is approved to be substantial changes to what the draft was. But it's based on values around impacting the sort of four key values: impact and sustainability, quality and integrity, equity, collaborations and partnerships. So that sort of sets the values of what underpins the rest of the strategy. And then there's a series of goals that have been articulated: drive national prosperity and security, lead the world in health outcomes, deliver equity, no one left behind, secure a resilient and sustainable health system, and finally strengthen regional and global partnerships. And then within that, there are a number of pillars, I guess, which are focus areas that go into more detail, which I won't step through all the details of that. And then finally, was identified what are the enablers? How do we ensure these things can be achieved? Workforce is a key one, and this is not a straightforward exercise to even determine what is the Australian health and medical research workforce. It's funded by different organisations, people are employed in different contexts, and actually this is not a straightforward question to answer, but we need a grasp of what is that workforce? Is it appropriate for what's needed going into the future? What training and development is needed, and what's the size and the shape of that? Funding is another one you'd think would be clearly understood. We know who we fund at the NHMRC, the MRFF knows where those grants go. If you look at a global picture of Australia, particularly if you look at where industry is funding health and medical research and where philanthropy is, it's really opaque, and there's no clear way to understand that. So there's quite a few data challenges actually just to create and understand the status quo here. Data and advanced technologies are key enablers, and then finally the infrastructure piece. And that infrastructure doesn't just mean bricks and mortar or equipment. Infrastructure is around also collaborative centres and other collaborative arrangements are in place. So that's a broader understanding of infrastructure. So then coming out of all of that, it ultimately there needs to be actions. And the strategy does not, in fine detail, look to laying out a series of implementation roadmap, I guess, of all the things that will be done. Partly because it's a 10-year strategy and that's going to evolve over time. But also what the approach has been taken is to establish a National Strategy Advisory Council, which would look to, I guess, hold government to account on the progress and implementation of this strategy. So that would be a council that would monitor progress, look at the key milestones, KPIs, and if someone's not measuring this and keeping it accountable, then, as you know, things don't necessarily happen. So this is an accountability and a governance piece that's being proposed to sit over the top of this to ensure that the strategy is delivered. As far as next steps on the national strategy, so this is, I guess, a timeline of since the draft was released. The submission process, as I said, has closed. There's been a number of webinars that hopefully you've been able to join on. Roundtables been held with states and territories, and also thematic workshops focused on particular areas. There's a technical advisory group that is bringing in a lot of the peak bodies to provide specific input on the strategy. And now it moves into an analysis and policy development phase. So really, what did all that feedback say? Look to now make changes to the strategy, finalise it towards the end of the year, and then it's over to government really to decide, and ultimately it's the government will approve and decide on the future of that strategy. And then it's I guess the most important part after that, it's implementation and what that looks like. I mentioned at the outset that this work really came out of, one of the places this came out of was the consultations we've held around harmonising NHMRC and the MRFF. And I guess this was from a lot of comments made around some concerns from the sector that it wasn't always clear that the two funds were working in sync, that they weren't necessarily complementing each other. There was duplication in places, whether that's in funding of clinical trials, for example, things down to the nuts and bolts of how you apply. Are there differences? Making sure the funding calendar for the year is harmonised. So there's lots of practical issues, and there's also larger sort of structural and strategic things around alignment here. So as I mentioned, the national health consultations were held in 2023 now. And that report that summarised those was released published by the Minister in May of last year. And as I mentioned, it really suggested that the funds need to come together under a single agency, which would be the NHMRC. But that would require all sorts of decisions of Cabinet. There's potential legislative implications for that and budget implications and the like. So those things need to be considered, and government has not yet formally made a response to those what it heard out of the consultations. But as I said, the national strategy is the priority, so that is leading now. And the draft national strategy, as you will have seen, does have as an action to implement this reform and bring the funds together. But the Minister did want NHMRC and the department to get on with harmonising now, not wait for the national strategy and not wait for the formal machinery of government type things to run through. So really he's asked us, get together and work out what you can harmonise now, and we've been doing that for the last, well, at least since the middle of last year. The key, I think the most impactful reform that we have done, that we had control over, was for the first time to bring together advisory committees that were to for the first time give advice to the CEO of NHMRC about our funds and our operations, and at the same time give advice to the department and the CEO of the Health Medical Research Office there that looks after the MRFF. and consider, when their advice, the two funds together, which seems sort of logical, right? But we had not got to that point over the history of the MRFF. So this diagram shows the new advisory structures that we have for the two funds. So sitting above it, we have the Minister for Health, and we have the Steve as our CEO at the NHMRC, and we have the Department of Health and the officials for the MRFF side. The MRFF does have the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board, AMRAB. That's required under the legislation of the MRFF Act, and it is to set the research priorities and the strategy for the MRFF. And then we have the Council of the NHMRC, which again is required under our legislation. And those two committees or boards had not previously met together. Since December last year, when we put in place this new structure, they are now joint meetings. So we have cross members, we have one meeting together of AMRAB and Council, and that's how we're going to continue to do it, despite the legislation saying that we have these two committees. And then sitting underneath those key committees, we have the, I guess, committees that are focused on particular aspects or policy areas. So we have the NHMRC Research Committee, which really is the engine room at NHMRC around how we run our grant programs, things like peer review, where the money should go, how we should cut that up into different programs and the like. And we have and that is in NHMRC, that's again required under our legislation. But then in the sort of purple or mauve boxes here, we have 4 committees that we have established that are topic focused. So there's first and these are jointly NHMRC MRFF committees. So there's the NHMRC MRFF Consumer Advisory Group, giving advice on all matters around consumer and community involvement across the funds. We have the Indigenous Advisory Group, the Industry, Philanthropy and Commercialisation Committee, and then I guess the other side of that translational coin is the Public Health and Health Systems Committee. And while this is sort of, inside the beltway, corporate governance type stuff, the bringing together of people to give advice across these two funds is making a profound difference. And, we'll look to see, once government makes a decision around these reforms, what the future would look like. And I think if that's not going to happen before the national strategy is finalised. But in the meantime, this is making an important difference around how the two funds are harmonising. Moving now to some of the particular actions that we're doing, as I set out in that plan on a page I mentioned at the outset. So one area I mentioned was peer review, optimising peer review processes. This is a continual area of focus and has been over a long time. You'll be aware that we've made a number of big changes to that in recent years, in particular moving from the old days of having panels that came to Canberra for 6 weeks to review project grants, through to a distributed process where it was what we refer to as application-centric peer review, where we can match particular experts with applications, and I might touch on that a little bit more. But here's this sort of a shopping list of a whole bunch of areas that we are continually thinking about and focusing on. So maybe just first starting with the virtual versus app-centric GRPs. We continue to have GRPs, as in a panel, a peer review panel for a number of our schemes. So we still have it for our clinical trials scheme and partnership projects, and a number of our smaller or focused areas. So for example, our targeted calls for research, where it's focused on a particular area, we find it's really useful still to bring together a panel that can discuss the proposals as a group. Our larger scale schemes, in particular investigator grants and ideas grants, is where we've moved to this application-centric approach. And really one of the key things that has enabled is, instead of having to form these artificial groupings of panels and hope that everyone on that panel has expertise around the applications that land there, instead now we can take the many hundreds of peer reviewers that get involved in those schemes, and we can match the best 5 people to that application, and that might be different to the next application and the third application. So that's really the heart of what application-centric peer review does. It comes with pros and cons. We lose some things and we gain some things. But what we find in our data is the suitability of the peer reviewer when they say, are you an expert on this application? Can you provide an expert opinion on it? The level of answering yes this is something I squarely know about, is much, much higher now than it was in the old days, where people would be on a panel and think, I'm sort of only peripherally understanding this, but I'm on this panel, so I have to evaluate it. There's been a big shift there. We're also seeing a shift in reducing burden as far as the number of applications that have to be peer reviewed. But this is a continual area of feedback we get, I have to say. So every time Steve goes anywhere around the country and talks, one of the first things people say is, when are you going to bring back GRPs? Because we love to come together in person, and we understand the reasons for that. And this is, as I say, this is something that we'll continually talk about at Research Committee, how we can modernise and keep our peer review processes most efficient. A couple of things that we are looking at is shared scores and comments. So one bit of feedback we got about this peer review process of application-centric peer review is there's a perception that there's a loss of accountability. You're no longer sitting around a panel looking at your colleagues in the face and having to talk about the proposal. You're sort of in your own office and scoring. And so one of the things we're doing to address that is that for those larger schemes, peer reviewers will have to share their comment and their scores with the other 4 members of that sort of virtual panel for that application. And you therefore, I guess, you'll be held to some degree of account and transparency amongst that other group of people, and you'll have an opportunity to see theirs and reconsider, have you considered this application fairly? Have you made an effort with your comments, or is it just a really short, pithy line that's not very helpful? Your colleagues will see that, and so this is really a sort of an accountability and transparency measure. We're also looking at distributed peer review. This is a concept where basically we want to share the load. So everyone who's applying for NHMRC grants and receiving them should be involved in the peer review, because the system has to be run by the researchers and applicants. And the distributed peer review basically says, if you apply for a grant and we ask you to be a peer reviewer and you say no, well then we can throw your grant out. It becomes an eligibility matter that we can choose to have, which has been done internationally. It's something that we're considering for the Ideas Grant scheme, where it's a very large-scale scheme. We have many peer reviewers on that. And of course, we have to manage the conflict of interest and those other issues with that. This is something that we're discussing. Artificial intelligence and machine learning. Already we're looking to use tools to, I guess, match in a better way the best peer reviewers with an application. But there's an opportunity for these tools as they improve to be able to really scrape the internet, find areas of your expertise, consider the application, and then look to see how we can match. We do need to consider how humans are still involved in this, and AI, I think, will never be a decision-making process for this. But I think there are lots of very useful ways we can use these tools, but it's something we have to be cautious as we progress with that. Consumer and community involvement, I'll talk about more in a moment. I might, in the interest of time, move on to the next slide. So the community and consumer involvement. So this is an area that is a really strong focus for us. We currently have a statement. It was released in 2016 that sets out how consumer and community should be involved in medical research. It was co-published with us and the Consumer Health Forum of Australia. But 2016 is quite a long time ago, and expectations, I think, from the community and from researchers have really shifted. And there's a continuing, I think, really virtuous improvement, in my view, around expectations that consumers bring benefit. Research is better when consumers are involved. Certain types of research, this is completely obvious that's needed. In fact, the research can't be done without consumer participation. But then you take it through to the other end of the spectrum. Basic laboratory, you might be doing cell biology in a laboratory, never talking to a person, never even looking at a model animal, potentially. This sort of basic discovery stuff. How do you get consumers involved there, and are they of benefit? And I guess what we keep hearing from our advisory committees is having consumers seeing why we're doing that research, giving their insights to it, even that produces a lot of benefit. So it's a continuum and it's a complex area, but I guess the reason we're focusing in here is times have changed and expectations have changed, and we want to be world leading in how consumers are involved in research. So we are updating that statement to make it reflect what the modern expectations. We produced a discussion paper around these issues in last year, and that was led a national consultation with Monash Health Partners and the Australian Health Research Alliance. So we engaged them to hold a series of roundtables and workshops around a discussion paper, and hopefully you're able to have some visibility or get involved in that. That occurred in between March and May of last year. And then since then, what we heard from those consultations has led to developing the draft statement, which we are consulting on at the moment. And we have held, over July to September, we held 18 in-person workshops all around Australia in all state and territory capital cities and also in regional areas, and we held online workshops as well. And again, hopefully people online listening to this and in the room may have had an opportunity to engage in that consultation process. As I mentioned, the statement is broad and it is intended to cover all aspects of people participating in the system. Us as the funders, institutions who conduct research and employ researchers, the research community itself, the community. And it sets out that each of these groups have got their own responsibilities and have a role to play in progressing consumer involvement in research. The statement, the draft statement, deliberately does not have a detailed implementation plan for all of those groups. Really, it's for those organisations to then consider how they implement the plan themselves. But as funders in NHMRC, we're already getting on with looking to implement aspects of that, which I'll touch on in a moment. Some of the feedback we did hear, though, is that people would like to see a little bit more of a roadmap or a little bit more, some more actions to be implemented around this. So that's one of the things we're considering in the current version that will be looking to be finalised in the coming months. So one of the things where we have full control over, I guess, is how we involve consumers in peer review. This is something that we and the MRFF have done for a while, but it's in different approaches, and it's done differently internationally. So, as I mentioned, there's different types of research, really translational research, research that really is a touch point with the community, through to research that seems to be a lot further away from the community. And we need to consider how our different schemes can involve consumers in that context. Our targeted calls for research is one program, though, that is usually really well set up to have consumer involvement, because they usually focus on topics that have come from the community or come from Senate inquiries or come from states and territories saying there's a key issue that we need additional funding and a focus on. For example, it might be tick-borne diseases, MECFS, it could be around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, and particular aspects of that. We have a call open at the moment around safer families. And there, it's really appropriate that we have consumers involved. So for a long time, what we've done is we've said 80% of the scoring will be done by non-consumer or academic and scientific assessors, and then 20% will be on consumer aspects of the proposal. And what we find is that if you don't have really meaningful consumer involvement from the start of the proposal, and you can demonstrate it in your application that this is meaningful partnership, you will not get a very positive score from these consumer scorers. And as you know, our funding is so competitive, that can absolutely be the difference between funded or not. So this is around ensuring accountability, but also it's around driving behaviour. We are now expanding this to one of our larger scale schemes for the first time, and that is for the next round of the clinical trials and cohort study scheme. Again, a scheme that you cannot conduct without the community being involved by definition. But this is a large-scale scheme. These are sometimes very technical proposals around the technical aspects of clinical trials and having the right power and methodology and the like. But clearly, you need to be able to demonstrate how the community and the consumers are involved in these processes and that you're using them appropriately and you're doing it in partnership with them. So we are going to roll out that same model for the next round. 80% of the proposal will be evaluated by the scientific experts and 20% will be by consumers, looking at consumer criteria. We'll do it in 2 stages. So a shortlisting process will be done first with the scientific scoring, and then those applications that are shortlisted will come together on a panel, and that's when the consumers will come together, which we think is a better way to, it reduces the effort that consumers have to go through. They can just focus on those applications that make it through, and then they can be involved in that panel type discussion. The funding rate for clinical trials and cohort studies is about 10%. So again, if you cannot demonstrate really meaningful partnership and involvement of consumers and benefit to the community through your application, I think you have 0 chance of being funded through this scheme. So we think we're going to evaluate how this goes, but I think this should really drive those behaviours that we want to see. MRFF also involves consumers in peer review. All of their grant opportunities have consumer observers who provide commentary around the proposal, but they do not score, in most cases, the applications that's done by the scientific members of the panel. So there are different ways of doing this, and one of our challenges, I guess, once the consumer statement is finalised, is we have to look ahead at our other schemes, look at our big-scale schemes like Investigator and Ideas, including the fact that they do application-centric peer review that are not on a panel together. How can we get consumer involvement in that? And that's something we'll continue to consult on and we'll talk to our advisory committees about. Moving on to another key aspect that I mentioned at the outset around sitting across all the work we do is this equity lens. We want to consider this both in terms of impact, meaning improving the health of all Australians in an equitable way, no matter where you live, no matter who you are, but also in terms of workforce, so that funding and opportunities for all researchers is equitable. And then we have a number of things I'd like to discuss in more detail. So there's the work we're doing around closing the gap, our gender initiatives, and a current focus we have on rural, regional and remote Australia. So firstly, just on gender equity, this is something, we have a gender equity strategy that's been running since 2022, and we have done a number of substantial initiatives and really put our money where our mouth is, I'd say, around looking to address gender equity. And a couple of the key ones you'll be, I'm sure, well aware of is we have a process to ensure equal number of grants are awarded to men and women in the leadership category, the highest category of our investigator grants. And what we really see when you look at the workforce is that there are equal numbers of men and women in the very early career stages, and then as the career stages progress, you tend to see women falling out of the workforce, usually through, of course, for all sorts of other demands that are driving that on them. And the few that manage to stay through to the top end are often very strongly competitive, and so the funding rates actually are quite strong for the top group. But there aren't many of them, and so we needed to actually ensure that we'd have the same number of grants to both sides, not just equal funding rates there. So that was a major initiative we've done. We've also got structural priority funding for women lead investigators. So we want half of the NHMRC's applications to be led by a female investigator. And in some cases that has meant initiatives where we take our funding list based on scoring, and we normally just work down that funding list based on where you sit on it. But in order to address this measure, we've skipped over effectively men to pick up women lead investigators further down the list, the next most meritorious on the scoring. And we've done that very deliberately because unless you actually are going to quarantine money and have sort of effectively 2 races of funding, you aren't going to shift the dial on this. We now achieve that, and we get 50%, and for most schemes, in many contexts, we don't need to do any of this priority funding. It falls out by itself. So these sorts of measures are really shifting the dial around this issue. We've also published in July of last year what we refer to in the office as the SXG statement, because otherwise we have to call it the Statement on Sex, Gender, Variations and Sex Characteristics and Sexual Orientation in Health and Medical Research, and that's hard to say in meetings, so we've shortened it to SXG. But this statement is really to say, for too long, medical research has not considered gender issues when conducting and designing experiments. Things like clinical trials that don't consider pregnant women, even down to the degree of where types of model animals that are chosen for experiments, whether they're of one type of gender or another. And this causes all sorts of biases, of course, in the data and results in inequitable outcomes. And so this statement is setting out our expectations for considering sex, gender and variations in research. And now we're working through a process of implementation. So what are we going to expect of applicants? And that process is coming out shortly, but it will be things around how do we, in application, require people to explain that they've thought of these matters and how they're addressing it in the design of their research proposals. Moving to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, again, I said this is always one of our major health priorities, and closing the gap is a key thing that we want to, with the funding that we are custodians of, we want to ensure that we are doing what we can to progress that agenda. We're guided under Roadmap 3, and these roadmaps set out our actions around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. Currently, we have 2 key targets that we look to do with our funding. The first is we've got a commitment, we've had this for quite a while, that we will spend at least 5% of the Medical Research Endowment account on research that's focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, but usually we're well above that. And so in 24/5, 8.3% of our funding was focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. More recently, we added a new target, which was also around ensuring that the research that we fund is led by an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researcher. And our target there is that 3.4% of all of the NHMRC grants that are awarded in a year will be led by an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researcher. And we again hit that target, and 4.4% of grants were awarded last time. And we do this again, like in the gender initiative, using what we refer to as structural funding. So we will fund down the list of grants, but then we will look to pick up additional meritorious grants that are high quality research that are led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers in order to lift up that target. And it's really around building capacity, and we're wanting to do the same thing that we've achieved in the gender area around building that capacity in the sector and having it self-sustaining. We've also funded a $10 million special initiative in 2022 to run over 5 years, which is our Collaborations in Health Services grant, or OCA, and that is a national network that's bringing together researchers from around Australia focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. We also have a tripartite agreement with New Zealand and Canada for the 3 countries to work on collaborative measures to further the health of the Indigenous populations of those countries. And currently, actually, we're in conversations with the Nordic countries and Canada and New Zealand around potentially doing an international collaboration in this area, which, if progresses, I think will be really exciting, and I'll be pleased to talk about if that eventuates. Rural, regional and remote Australia. So we've identified this in our this training as another priority area. And so this again reflects that the health outcomes of people that live in regional Australia are poorer than in metropolitan Australia. And unless you actually measure this and you do something about it, put money towards it, nothing will change. So we are looking now to implement some funding measures and other activities to ensure both that researchers in regional Australia have equitable access to funding, but also that most importantly, that the health outcomes of regional Australians has the same potential benefit for the research that we fund as the people that live in the cities. We also have a key responsibility in fostering high standards in health research. In the interest of time, I'll move a bit more quickly through these couple of slides, but to say that, as you'll be aware, we develop a number of codes and guides around how research should be conducted with humans, also the use of animals in research, and in this year we've produced also the NHMRC Good Institutional Practice Guide, which is to set out, I guess, a guide on how institutions, employers should set a culture and expectations to perform at their best. I guess one of the key things I want to say from this slide about research integrity is this is something that we take really seriously, and there's been a long discussion around whether the system is adequate around investigating misconduct areas, and this is a piece of work that is Steve in particular and the ARC are talking about continually and considering how we can ensure that system is adequate, and so there's that will continue to happen. Sort of just moving towards the end of what I wanted to talk about this morning, I do want to say a couple more things about research translation. Here you'll see a picture of Australia marking out the various NHMRC research translation centres. These come together under the Australian Health Research Alliance, and they are really geographically located centres that are designed to bring together researchers and health system providers to solve problems of health systems locally. And here in Queensland, we have a couple of centres, one based here in southeast Queensland and then another one into the north, but they're located, we have rural-focused and metro-focused centres around Australia. And NHMRC accredits these centres, but we've never funded them directly. They were expected to get funding separately, usually from state and territory governments. But for the first time, we have actually funded them this year through a grant opportunity, and that is to provide $1 million to each of the 12 centres over the course of this financial year and next through to mid-2027. And that is to, I guess, ensure the viability of the research translation centres. And what we're doing at the moment is evaluating what those are achieving and considering long-term funding. And it's also spoken about in the national strategy, draft national strategy, if you've seen that there. But we think these are a really important initiative to drive translational outcomes directly in local health services. We also have conducted last year a $15 million one-off grant opportunity, the collaborations in health services research. These were $1 million grants to fund a group of small-scale proof-of-concept type health services applications that are designed to try something quickly, fail fast, adapt if it's not working, but again, they're to be locally focused on health services. We fund translational research through all of our schemes, but of course we also produce our guidelines, which is a major way that we can take, I guess, the end point of all that research into improving health in the community. We're currently evaluating and renewing that research translation strategy, though, and so that will be out next year, and we're looking to ensure that's tied together with the national objectives of the national strategy. Might just move through to guidelines. So as I mentioned, guidelines is sort of the end point in some ways for a lot of the research that we fund. And here's just an example of some of the pieces that we produce regularly. We're currently at the moment updating the Australian dietary guidelines. Included in that was a proposal around looking at the environmental and the sustainability aspects of Australian diet, which I'm not sure if Steve will get asked about today at Set Estimates, but that had raised concerns, particularly from certain constituents around what that might mean for eating meat and the like. But it's so I'll look forward to hearing from Steve later today around whether that was asked. But also water quality, PFAS chemicals and the like is really hot topics at the moment. And these guidelines are key ways that we, I guess, set the standards for Australian community. So just towards the very end of the comments, I wanted to say something about global health. Again, I mentioned at the start that I guess the political environment is changing. We've had, there's been issues, of course, around funding and collaborations with America at the moment, and we do have a number of international collaborations that are affected by that. We want to ensure that as NHMRC, we are still outward looking to the world and that we are wanting to collaborate on a global scale with our international colleagues. And a few things that we'll be doing to support that. We have an international engagement strategy that we'll be updating that comes to an end next year, and I'll talk about it briefly. But we're also going to put out some communication and produce a CEO statement that really reflects that, to say that Australians, researchers, should focus on improving the health of Australians, but also we will fund and will reward people that are working internationally with collaborators and looking to further global health initiatives. As part of that, we are introducing a new Research Excellence Award in March of next year, which will be the Michael Alpers Global Health Award, named in his honour, and it will look to identify the highest quality global health-focused research grant that we have funded in each year, and then providing that award. On working with international partners, we do have a research engagement, international engagement strategy that underpins how we should do that. Really what it says is we should focus on our region. We want to ensure that we are boosting capacity and that we're sharing knowledge through these collaborations. And we prefer to work on multilateral collaborations where we can. And listed here is a number of the multilateral collaborations that we do, but we're also involved in a number of bilateral collaborations. Artificial intelligence, just to briefly say that this is an area, as I mentioned, that is on our minds. We can see that this is going to be profound consequences for the healthcare delivery, but also how people write their grants, how their grants are reviewed, how we operate as funder. And there's a bunch of work that's been going on around that. As I mentioned, it's one of our health priorities for this triennium. So just to wrap up, because we're just about at time here, I wanted to again underline there's a number of big strategic things happening that it's really important that the sector gets involved in. So the MRFF MREA alignment is going to, I think, be a really important change to how that 1.65 billion is strategically divided up and then awarded. The national strategy, which will be finalised this year, but then two other key pieces is the national one-stop shop, which is being led by Emeritus Professor Ian Chubb around, I guess, making clinical trials more efficient and improving approval processes and the like, and the strategic examination of research and development being led out of the Department of Industry, which is, I guess, rather than focusing on medical, it's the broad research and development evaluation for the government. So it's really important that these pieces all come together, and these are all being done in unison, and we're having conversations with the different participants of those and at our advisory committees. So just my final slide to finish with is, I think what Steve often referred to for himself as the things that kept him up at night, but has sort of reframed it now to being critical challenges. And really these are some of the key things that are on our mind that sort of wraps all this together. So the national strategy, we want to make sure that it's truly a national strategy, that it isn't just a document, that it actually really changes the way the system works and improves it for the better. And this is going to be, it's one thing to produce the strategy, the next thing is to then implement, and so this is going to be a long-term piece of work. The productivity and sustainability of the health system, I mentioned already around the funding rates separating from how much we get and how much the research costs. The true cost of research, the gap between salaries, these sorts of issues we're constantly thinking about. I mentioned already the role of artificial intelligence, and then major health challenges, dementia, ageing, antimicrobial resistance, these things we'll continue to monitoring to see how we need to respond to those. Finally, mistrust and the misinformation and trust in science. We keep hearing concerns around this, and if you look at the Tylenol autism event most recently and a number of others, there's continual need, I guess, for us to demonstrate through the way the NHMRC operates, through the funding, the competitive process, ensuring that it's equitable, ensuring there's integrity through that process, and that we can then be confident in the advice that we provide and confident in each other in the scientific process, I think it is now more important than it ever has been. And we as custodians of the NHMRC will try to do what we can to progress that. And then I think the Australian research community as well has a key role in calling out these things and ensuring that there is integrity in the system and that information is true and accurate, and that's something I think we have all responsibility to do together. So I'm over time, so I will stop there, but thanks so much for your attention, and good morning.